Hello everyone, our lesson for today is all about international trade agreement. So in this lesson, I will be discussing about the definition of international trade and its history. A trade agreement, also known as a trade pact, is a wide-ranging taxes, tariff, and trade treaty that often includes investment guarantees. It exists when two or more countries agree on terms that help them trade with each other. The most common trade agreements are of the preferential and free trade types, which are concluded in order to reduce or eliminate tariffs, quotas, and other trade restrictions on items traded between the signatories. Now let's go to the history of international trade. The contemporary world has become increasingly economically interconnected since Adam Smith allowed the division of labor. So Adam Smith was the father of modern economics. He was also the 8th century Scottish economist, philosopher, and an author. And he wrote the book The Wealth of Nations in the year 1776. And David Ricardo, an English economist, highlighted the comparative advantage of trading with other nations. International trade has grown in complexity, as has the number of trade agreements. So, this English economist, David Ricardo, who gave systematized classical form to the rising science of economics in the 19th century. His laissez-faire doctrines were exemplified in his iron law of wages, which stated that all attempts to improve the real income of workers were fruitless and that wages perforce would remain near the subsistence level. So the fundamental reason for international trade is some nations are better at producing certain things than the others. So the logic of formal trade agreements is that they outline what is agreed upon and the punishments for deviation from the rules set in the agreement. For the majority of the 16th century and until the end of the 18th centuries, the philosophy of mercantilism controlled the trade policy of the major European nations. According to the mercantilists, the primary goal of trade was to achieve a favorable balance of trade, in which the value of one's exports exceeded the value of one's imports. The mercantilist trade strategy prohibited states from performing trade partnerships. This is because governments aided home industry by imposing duties and quotas on imports, as well as prohibiting the export of tools, capital equipment, trained personnel, or anything else that could help foreign countries compete with domestic manufacturing. Now, one of the best examples of the mercantilist trade is the policy during the British Navigation Act of 1651. So this act states that foreign ships were prohibited from taking part in coastal trade in England, and all imports from continental Europe were required to be carried by either British ships or ships that were registered in the country where the goods were produced. The entire philosophy of mercantilism would come under fire, but thanks to the writings of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who both emphasize the importance of imports and claim that exports were only a necessary expense of getting them. Their ideas grew in popularity and they contributed to spark a trend toward more liberalized trade, which the United Kingdom would lead. So in 1823, the Reciprocity of Duties Act, which helps the British carry commerce and enabled reciprocal abolition of import tariffs possible under bilateral trade agreements with other countries. And then in 1846, the Corn Laws, which had levied restrictions on grain imports, were repealed. And by 1850, most protectionist policies on British imports had been dropped. Further, the Cobden Chevalier Treaty between Britain and France enacted significant reciprocal tariff reductions. It also included a most favored nation clause, or MFN, a non-discriminatory policy that requires countries to treat all other countries the same when it comes to trade. This treaty helped spark a number of MFN treaties throughout the rest of Europe, initiating the growth of multilateral trade liberalization or free trade. By the late 19th century, the trend toward more liberalized multilateral trading had slowed due to the world's economy's devastating slump in 1873. The downturn, which lasted until 1877, increased pressure for more local protection while dampening any prior momentum to reach overseas markets. In 1878, Italy enacted a mild set of tariffs, with more severe duties enacted in 1887. With its iron and rye tariff in 1879, Germany reverted to more protectionist measures, and France followed suit with its Milan tariff in 1892. Only the United Kingdom, out of all the major Western European powers, has stuck to its free trade policies. With the United States and the United Kingdom emerging as economic superpowers following World War II, the two countries felt compelled to devise a plan for a more cooperative and open international system. The 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement gave birth to the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, the World Bank, and the International Trade Organization, or ITO. ITO failed to materialize in its goal to supervise the establishment of a non-preferential multilateral trade system, and it was picked up by the GATT, which was created in 1947. So the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, was since its establishment, there has been a trend of increased multilateral trade agreements, those involving three or more countries, and increased local regional trade agreements. GATT, which existed from 1947 to 1995, was an agreement to regulate trade among more than 120 countries, and the purpose is for substantial reduction of tariffs and other trade between our trade barriers, and the elimination of preferences or an opportunity of prior choice or claim. Since the inauguration of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, there has been a dual trend of increasing multilateral trade agreements, those between three or more nations, as well as more local regional trade agreements. Following the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, the World Trade Organization took over as the global regulator of world trade liberalization from the GATT in 1995. Unlike the GATT, which focused exclusively on products, WTO expanded to include regulations on services, intellectual property, and investment. By the early 21st century, the WTO had grown to approximately 145 members, with China joining in 2001. While the World Trade Organization tries to expand the GATT's multilateral trade policies, recent trade talks look to be ushering in a period of multilateralizing regionalism. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or the TTIP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Regional Cooperation in Asia and the Pacific, or RCEP, account for a large share of global GDP and trade, implying that regionalism is evolving into a broader, more multilateral framework. Now, that's the end of our lesson for today. So, in conclusion, while the history of international commerce or international trade may appear to be a battle between protectionism and free trade, the modern environment now allows both types of policies to flourish simultaneously. Indeed, it is possible that the option between free trade and protectionism is a false one. Advanced nations are realizing that economic growth and stability depend on a strategic mix of trade policies. Trade agreements therefore make misunderstandings less likely and create confidence on both sides that cheating will be punished. This increases the likelihood of long-term cooperation. And international organizations such as the IMF can further incentivize cooperation by monitoring compliance with the agreements and reporting third countries of the violations. Monitoring by international agencies may be needed to detect non-tariff barriers, which are disguised attempts at creating trade barriers. So I hope you learned something for today's lesson. So for further reference, you can also view this on this link. Have a good day, everyone.